Scotland doesn't warn you with signs, it warns you with silence. There are villages in this country where locals stop talking the moment you mention the name, where tourists arrive with cameras and leave without words, where you ask about the history of a place and the barman looks away. I spent weeks going through historical archives, disappearance records and local testimonies to bring you the 18 Scottish villages that even Scots themselves avoid. And what I found goes far beyond folklore. What's at stake here is simple. There are places where the beauty is the trap, where the landscape calls to you, and where nobody comes back quite the same way. But before we get to the first one, I need to tell you something that most travel guides refuse to admit. Some of these villages don't have legends because someone invented them, but they have them because something created them. Village number 1, Clachanseal. There's a bridge on the west coast of Scotland that maps call the Bridge over the Atlantic. A stone bridge built in 1792 connecting the mainland to an island called Seal. It's small, it's old, and when you cross it, you get the strange feeling that something on the other side didn't want you to arrive. Clachanseal doesn't look dangerous. That's exactly the problem. For 2 centuries, the island of Seal was the backbone of a brutal industry, slate quarrying. The pits reached 75 metres deep, dug almost 250 feet below sea level, with only thin walls of rock separating the workers from the ocean. But it wasn't the rock that killed them first. It was the water. On the night of the Great Storm of 1881, an exceptional tide rose over the island. The water entered the pits without warning. The machinery was submerged. The industry that had fed 3,000 people collapsed in a single night. Families were left destitute from one morning to the next. The neighbouring island of Easdale was left nearly deserted. At its lowest point, only 3 people lived there. Those flooded pits are still there. Some reach 90 metres deep. And the local community has spent generations warning, don't go near the edge at night. But there's something else the archives don't easily record. After the Jacobite Rebellion of 1745, the British government banned kilts, bagpipes and the Gaelic language. Men from Seal crossing the bridge to the mainland had to change their clothes at the threshold, leaving behind who they were. The name of the inn on the other side says it all. Teague and Truish, Eve the House of the Trousers, a place where an entire people learn to hide their identity, and where that habit of keeping silent never fully disappeared. Village number 2. The shores of Loch Awe. Britain's longest loch sits in Argyll. It's called Loch Awe, 29 kilometres of cold water, black in winter, holding a disproportionate number of stories that locals prefer not to repeat out loud. Scottish folklore says the loch was created by accident. The Cailleach, goddess of winter, had one single responsibility: to cover the sacred spring of Ben Cruachan before the sun went down. One day she sat down on the path, closed her eyes, and the sun set. Water poured out through the night and flooded the glen. The gods turned her to stone, and there she remains on the slopes of Ben Cruachan, head bowed, staring at what her lapse created. It's just a legend. But at Loch Awe, legends tend to have physical consequences. Those who have kayaked the loch describe something meteorologists know well. It generates its own microclimate. The weather can change in minutes. A clear sky becomes wind and waves without warning. Drownings have been documented for decades, and most involve fishermen who didn't expect conditions to shift so fast. And there's an account from Andrew Lang, a 19th century Scottish writer who collected from a boatman on the loch a story he chose not to name. A family lived nearby. They ran an inn. People came in, but didn't always come out. The eldest son was eventually arrested. He confessed to 19 murders before emigrating to America, where he opened another inn and started again. The boatman gave Lang the family's name. Na Lang decided not to publish it. Better forgotten, he wrote. Village number 3. Ballantrae. At first glance, Ballantrae is a quiet fishing village on the Ayrshire coast. At second glance, it's one of the darkest places in all of Scotland. In the 18th century, it was the centre of operations for a smuggling network that could muster over 100 men armed with sabres and pistols. The contraband was hidden inside the local church itself, behind the pews where the congregation would sit and pray the following Sunday. But the smuggling is almost picturesque compared to what is said to have lived in the caves of Pennan, a few kilometres to the north. Sawney Bean and his wife, known as Black Agnes Douglas, found a cave whose entrance was hidden beneath the water at high tide. They lived there for 25 years, and in that time, according to Scottish oral tradition, they murdered and consumed over 1,000 travellers. The cave stretched more than a kilometre deep. The remains of victims hung from the walls like meat in a butcher's shop. The king himself led the capture. 400 men with tracker dogs entered the cliffs. The male members of the clan were executed by having their hands and legs cut off and being left to bleed out. The women and children were burned alive. Historians debate whether Sawney Bean ever existed, but locals themselves admit, with a certain discomfort, that the Bean legends may have been deliberately created to keep the curious away from the caves where smugglers stored their goods. Which raises a question no tourist guide clearly answers. If the story was a fabrication designed to terrify, who fabricated it? And what were they trying to hide underneath? The cave is still there, accessible only at low tide, and locals still don't recommend it. And that's just the beginning. Because the three villages you've just heard about have something in common. At least one visitor saw it coming. What comes next is different. These are the places where nobody expected anything to happen. And that's exactly where it did. Village number 4, Crovey. There's a question architects cannot answer about Crovey. Why did anyone build here? A single row of white houses on the Aberdeenshire coast, wedged between the North Sea and cliffs that look as though they're trying to crush them. No road, no street. The gap between the front doors and the edge of the water is measured in steps. Crovey wasn't built by choice, it was built by punishment. But the families who settled here were driven off their inland land during the Highland clearances. Their landlords needed space for sheep. The evicted found the only space nobody else wanted, that impossible ledge between rock and water. They worked the boats of the very landlord who had expelled them, generation after generation. That was until the night of 31st January 1953. A storm came from the north. Hurricane-force winds, an exceptional tide, total darkness. The path to the neighbouring village was swept away by the sea. The sea defences gave way. By dawn, most of the residents picked up what they could carry and left. They didn't come back. Today, it has roughly 5 permanent residents year-round. In winter, the entire row stands empty. No mobile signal. No doctor within 20 kilometres. And if the weather turns, which on that coast can happen in minutes, the only way out is up a steep cliff path. Those who visit on a calm day describe something enchanting. Those who arrive when the north starts to move describe something else. One review simply says, "I wouldn't go back at night." Village number 5, the surrounds of Old Shawmore. Old Shawmore is a scattered hamlet of a dozen houses in Sutherland, at the far northwest tip of Scotland. The beach has white sand and turquoise water that in summer could pass for the Caribbean. But the cemetery sits right beside the car park, and that already says something about how the people here understand this land. What matters isn't Old Shawmore itself. It's what lies to the north, the territory around Sandwood Bay, reachable only on foot, across 7 kilometres of moorland with no road, and no signal, nothing but peat, wind and the Atlantic. Before the Cape Wrath Lighthouse was built in 1828, this stretch of coast was a death trap. No light, no signal. Invisible reefs sent ships to the bottom regularly. The writer Seton Gordon, documented that many of those wrecks are buried beneath the sands, in layers that storms reveal and then bury again. Accounts from the Sandwood cottage begin in the 1940s. A fisherman was woken by his dog. He saw a face at the window, a bearded sailor with brass buttons. When he went outside, nobody was there. No footprints either. In 1949 and 1953, the same pattern. Always the same figure. Always no trace. That in this corner of Sutherland there is a ghost with a proper name, known to locals as the ghosty, accepted as part of the landscape as naturally as the wind. It says something about what this place does to those who spend time here. Village number 6, Corgarth. At the far upper end of Strathdon, where winter closes the roads with snow for weeks at a time, stands Corgarth. A castle surrounded by silence, at the only point that controlled the route between Deeside and Speyside. Whoever held Corgarth held the northeast Highlands. It was burned in 1571, in 1689, after 1715. Every time it burned with consequences. The darkest moment was November 1571. The Forbes and the Gordon clans had been blood enemies for decades. In October 1571, Adam Gordon defeated the Forbes in battle. Weeks later, he marched on Corgarth. The laird was away. All that remained were his pregnant wife, Margaret Campbell, and 27 others, women, children, and servants. Margaret refused to surrender, but she fired a pistol into the knee of one of Gordon's men. Adam Gordon ordered wood piled against the walls and set the castle alight. All 28 people inside died. The story was preserved in the ballad Edom o' Gordon, sung by Scots for centuries. And at Corgarth, they say the screaming didn't stay only in the lyrics. In 2014, an English couple climbed to the old hall. The woman stopped before entering. She asked the custodian if the castle was haunted. He said no. She asked again. He asked her what she had felt. She hadn't seen anything, just a presence. The custodian said nothing more. The road to Corgarth is one of the first to close in winter. When the snow comes, the castle is completely cut off. Just the valley, the wind, and whatever has spent more than 4 centuries refusing to leave the walls. But all 3 of these places share something. In each one, the danger came from outside. What comes next is different. These are the places where the darkness was inside from the beginning, buried in the stone, written in records that nobody wanted published. Village number 7, Croik. At the end of a 16-kilometre single-track road, in an empty glen in Rossshire, there is a small white church. No village around it. Just the church, a churchyard, and the silence of a valley that once held people and no longer does. In May 1845, 80 people came here, not to pray. The 18 families of Glencalvy had been evicted by their landlord, who preferred to lease the land to a single sheep farmer. No nearby landowner would take them in. So they camped in the churchyard, in the rain, with poles and tarpaulin. 80 people, for days. A correspondent from the Times of London was there. The article he published on June 2nd, 1845, was one of the first to bring the Highland clearances to national attention. But it came too late for the people of Glencalvy. What remains of them today is in the glass of the east window of the church. Someone scratched messages into the diamond-shaped panes from outside. You can still read them. One says, Glencalvy people was in the churchyard here, May 24th, 1845. Another, Glencalvy is a wilderness below sheep, and the most disturbing of all, Glencalvy people, the wicked generation. Nobody knows for certain who wrote them. The correspondent said he couldn't communicate with the refugees because they spoke only Gaelic. And yet the messages are in careful copperplate English. Someone wanted to leave a record that those people existed, that they were here, and that they were erased. Nobody knows what became of them after that. Village number 8, Tynet. There is a building in Moray that looks like a barn. Rendered walls, small windows, slate roof, no cross, no bell tower, no symbol of any kind to suggest what it really is. For decades, that was precisely the point. Tynet is home to the oldest post-Reformation Catholic church in continuous use in Scotland. It was built in 1755, specifically so that nobody would recognise it as a church. The Scottish Reformation of 1560 made Catholic worship illegal, but in the Enzie district of Banffshire, noble families remained Catholic under the protection of the Gordons of Gordon Castle. For nearly 2 centuries, those communities practiced their faith in secret. When English soldiers returned from Culloden in 1746, they destroyed the chapels they found along the way. 9 years later, the local laird built a new one, with the public excuse that it was a sheepfold. No cross. The original windows were barely slits in the wall stuffed with straw. Instead of a cross on the roof, they placed a stone ball. It was the signal for those who knew what to look for. For everyone else, it was nothing. A building designed not to exist. For a community that practiced their faith knowing that discovery could carry serious consequences. The church at Tynet still stands, still in use, and the stone ball is still on the west gable, where they placed it in 1755. Village number 9, Ruthven. Visible from kilometres away, on a mound that dominates the valley of the River Spey, there is a roofless ruin. Only the outer walls remain. The wooden floors burned long ago, and what's left is a stone shell open to the sky. Ruthven barracks were built between 1719 and 1721 to control the Highlands. In August 1745, 200 Jacobites tried to take them. 12 soldiers held them off. One died, according to the sergeant in command, by foolishly holding his head above the parapet. 6 months later, they returned with artillery. This time, the sergeant surrendered. The day after the Battle of Culloden, up to 3,000 Jacobite survivors assembled at Ruthven. They waited for orders to regroup and fight on. They waited 4 days. On April 20th, the message arrived from Bonnie Prince Charlie. Let every man seek his own safety in the best way he can. It was the end. 3,000 men who had risked everything, receiving in return a single sentence that left them entirely alone. Before dispersing, they set fire to the barracks. That's why there is no roof. That's why there are no floors. The folklore adds an earlier layer. Alexander Stewart, the Wolf of Badenoch, held the castle that stood here before in the 14th century. Legend says that in July 1394, a stranger dressed entirely in black arrived and challenged him to a game of chess. By morning, nobody inside the castle was left alive. They say that on stormy days, the shadows of the wolf and his followers can still be seen in some dark corner of the ruins, playing their endless game. The site is free to enter, year-round. No guides, no opening hours, just the ruin, the valley wind, and the feeling that whatever broke here never quite finished breaking. But all 3 of these places share something beyond the history. In each one, someone tried to erase what existed. At Croik, they erased the people. At Tynet, they erased the faith. At Ruthven, they erased the hope. What comes next are the places where nobody tried to erase anything, where the darkness simply never left. Village number 10. Invergarry. On the shore of Loch Oich, south of Invergarry, there is an obelisk topped by a hand clutching a dagger, surrounded by 7 severed heads. It isn't decorative, it is a literal commemoration. In 1663, Alexander and Ranald MacDonald of Keppoch were stabbed to death by their own cousins. For 2 years, nothing happened. The killers had too many sympathisers. It was then that Iain Lom, Scotland's Gaelic poet laureate, borrowed 50 men, tracked down the 7 culprits, burned their house, and decapitated them as they fled the flames. MacLom wrapped the heads in his plaid and walked to Invergarry Castle to present them to the clan chief. Before arriving, he washed them in a spring beside the loch to make them more presentable. That spring has been called Tobar nan Sian ever since, the Well of the Heads. The monument was erected in 1812, but there is one detail it doesn't mention. Nobody knows for certain whether the 7 men executed were actually the murderers. When a nearby mound was exhumed years later, 7 headless skeletons were found inside. What wasn't recorded was whether anyone investigated before cutting. Invergarry Castle, where Bonnie Prince Charlie slept 2 nights during the 1745 rising, was blown up by the Duke of Cumberland 3 days after Culloden. Its ruins still stand beside the loch. The last night the prince slept there, yet he still believed he could win. Village number 11. Dalmally. Dalmally is a small village in Argyll at the northeast tip of Loch Awe. Its octagonal church holds medieval grave slabs carved with warriors. Many belong to the MacGregors. Clan MacGregor has a history no other Scottish clan can match for legal darkness. In 1603, King James VI didn't just seize their lands, he banned the name MacGregor. Anyone bearing it could be killed legally. Marrying one was a crime. For over 150 years, their descendants had to live under other names, to exist without official identity. The grave slabs in Dalmally Church are among the few physical traces that remain of their presence here, when the laws of the kingdom wanted them erased from the records entirely. But the most unsettling thing about Dalmally isn't in the church. It's accessible by a forest path south of the village. It's called Bar y Castellan, a complete settlement with stone walls still standing, abandoned in 1948. Not through disaster. The last inhabitants simply left, and nobody replaced them. The walls are there, the structures are standing. Those who visit describe the feeling that time stopped suddenly, as though the people who lived here expected to come back and never did. There is no signage leading to it, just the path, the walls, and the silence of something that ended without anyone explaining it fully. Village number 12. The surrounds of Sandwood Bay. We spoke about Sandwood Bay earlier, but there was something left deliberately unresolved. James McCrory Smith, known as Sandy, lived for 32 years in a cottage near the bay, alone, without company, without electricity, a life withdrawn from the world that began after his wife died in a car accident in which he was driving. It was Sandy that some visitors mistook for the ghost of the sailor. Sandy who appeared in the dunes and vanished before anyone could approach. Locals would warn him when tourists were coming so he could avoid them. But Sandy died, and after his death, the sightings continued. A bearded man, high boots, brass buttons, always in the dunes, always without footprints. The most comfortable explanation disappeared with Sandy. What remains has none. 3 places. 3 distinct kinds of darkness. But what comes next is different from everything before it, because the villages you've just heard about, however sinister, at least have witnesses, at least have someone who speaks. Now, what follows are the places where locals actively warn you not to go, not as advice, as a warning. Village number 13, Port Mahomac. Port Mahomac looks like a postcard village in Easter Ross, but the ground beneath it holds something no travel guide mentions. Over 13 seasons of excavation between 1994 and 2007, archaeologists from the University of York uncovered the first Pictish monastery ever excavated in Scotland. A community that in the 8th century was one of the most sophisticated stone carving centres in all of early Christian Europe. They produced books on vellum. They worked metal with advanced techniques. Around the year 820, it all ended in a single night. Archaeologists found the workshops burned, the sculptures smashed, used as rubble to level the ground. And in the burial area, the remains of 2 men with deep incisions in the skull, the kind made by an axe or a sword blade. The Vikings attacked Port Mahomac. There are no written records of that particular raid because nobody who could have written them survived. The monastery never recovered. But that wasn't all. In 1486, a raiding party from Clan Mackay took refuge in the local church after being defeated by Clan Ross. The Rosses pursued them inside and set the church on fire with everyone still in it. Port Mahomet was destroyed twice, and each time it was rebuilt on the ashes of what came before. Village number 14, Sertule, Hunt, Dunure. On a cliff top overlooking the Firth of Clyde, there is a ruin that in summer receives families with children. The ruins of Dunure are photogenic. There is a playground right next to them, but in the basement of what remains, there is a room that 16th century records call the Black Vault. The 4th Earl of Cassilis, Gilbert Kennedy, wanted the lands of Crossraguel Abbey. In August 1570, he had Alan Stewart, the Abbey's administrator, kidnapped and brought to Dunure. Stewart refused to sign over the lands. Kennedy sent him to the Black Vault and ordered him roasted alive over a fire on a spit until he gave in. 2 turns on the spit. Stewart signed after the second. The Scottish Privy Council ordered Kennedy to pay Stewart a pension for life as compensation. They also allowed him to keep the lands obtained under torture. Dunure Castle is free to enter. The playground is right next door. And nowhere in the visible signage is the Black Vault mentioned. Village number 15. Strontian is a village of around 400 people in the west of Scotland. Been known worldwide for one reason. Element number 38 on the periodic table, strontium, takes its name from here. It was discovered in 1787 in the lead mines of the surrounding hills. What is rarely mentioned is who worked those mines. During the Napoleonic Wars, the strontian mines produced almost all of the lead ammunition used by British forces, and part of the workforce was made up of captured French soldiers. Prisoners of war in a remote corner of the west of Scotland, extracting the metal from which the bullets that would kill their compatriots were made. The management of the mines was a continuous disaster. The York Building Company, which controlled them between 1730 and 1737, was described in the archives as perpetrating one of the most flagrant financial frauds of the age. They bankrupted the original founder before disappearing, and today the hills above Strontian are full of old shafts, flooded galleries, and unstable structures. Geological reports are direct, unstable, often flooded, many containing toxic gases. The Gaelic name of the village says it quietly, Sron Antasetain, the promontory of the Fairy Hill. In Scottish folklore, fairy hills are places where entering is easy and leaving is not always so. 3 places where the darkness hides behind something apparently ordinary: a fishing village, a tourist ruin, a name on the periodic table. What comes next is different. These are the places where nobody tried to disguise anything, where what happened was left exactly where it was. Village number 16. Fordown is a name most people don't recognise. A village in Aberdeenshire with no obvious distinguishing features. No castle, no famous loch. But Fordown is the birthplace of the man who wrote the first continuous chronicle of Scottish history. And what that man recorded about what he witnessed in his own lifetime is perhaps the most disturbing testimony that exists about the experience of living in medieval Scotland. John of Fordun, a 14th century cleric, wrote about the arrival of the Black Death in the first person. So great was this plague that fully 1/3 of humankind was destroyed. Those who fell sick of a great swelling of the flesh lasted barely 2 days. It generated such horror that children did not dare to visit their dying parents, nor parents their children, fleeing from contagion as from leprosy or a serpent. This is not a distant chronicle. This is the testimony of someone who watched the people around him die that way. Who watched families fracture under the terror of contagion, who documented the collapse of ordinary life knowing that if he didn't write it down, nobody would. The village that bears his name has no monument to John of Forden. No plaque, no museum, only a Pictish stone in the parish church and the outline of a disused military airfield in the surrounding fields, active during the Second World War, that no tourist guide mentions because almost nothing of it remains. Village number 17, Auchendrane. In 1875, Queen Victoria visited a place 6 kilometres south of Inverary and described it in her diary as a primitive village. It wasn't an insult, it was an accurate observation. Auchendrane is the only Highland township to have survived the clearances almost entirely unaltered. And while hundreds of similar communities were dismantled and their residents expelled, Auchendrane continued. The reason is simple. The land was so poor and so remote that it wasn't worth the trouble. The last resident left in the 1960s. But the houses are still standing, the stables are still standing, the tools are where they were left. It is one of the few places in Scotland where you can walk into a building that has not been reconstructed for tourists, but simply preserved as it was when the last person closed the door. Most visitors describe the same thing, the feeling that time didn't pass gradually here, that it stopped suddenly, that the people who lived here didn't expect to be leaving for good. The Gaelic name is Achad an Droigin, the field of the blackthorn. In Gaelic tradition, the blackthorn is the plant of boundaries between the world of the living and the world of the dead, the place where the two sides touch. Nobody named the village that as a joke. Village number 18, Kilmartin. There is a valley in Argyll with over 800 prehistoric monuments within a 10-kilometre radius. 150 of them are prehistoric. Bronze Age cairns, stone circles, standing stones, rock carvings that predate the pyramids of Egypt. It is, in essence, a cemetery that took 3,000 years to build. The Kilmartin Linear Cemetery is an alignment of 5 burial cairns arranged in a line stretching over 5 kilometres. Generations who decided to keep burying their dead along the same axis. The cup and ring marks carved into the exposed rock faces across the glen have been visible for 5,000 years, but nobody knows for certain what they mean. Every monument is open to the public without fencing, without opening hours, without a guide. You can descend the wooden steps into the burial chambers of Nether Largy and stand there in the darkness, surrounded by walls 5,000 years old. In 1990, archaeologists discovered beneath the ground what may be the largest timber circle ever found in Scotland. Completely hidden, unknown until that moment, after 800 recorded monuments, they were still finding things. The most recent major excavation uncovered structures that changed the interpretation of the entire site. That was in 2023. Nobody knows what they'll find next. And there it is. 18 villages, 18 stories that Scotland has kept in silence for centuries, not because they don't exist, but because there are places where silence isn't the absence of history. It's the history itself, waiting for someone brave enough to listen. 18 villages, 18 places where history decided not to leave, but there's something none of these places share with the ones that come next. The villages you've just heard about carried the weight of what happened. The ones coming now carry something different, the weight of what never arrived. 12 Scottish towns where time didn't move forward, where shop signs still read like the 1960s, where people carry on as though the rest of the world took a wrong turn and they decided not to follow. Some call them forgotten. Those who know them call them something else. The next video is already there.